All right, so I left my last lecture really kind of emphasizing the way that the Roman legacy would impact the way that Europeans would think about themselves, along as the way we thought about others in terms of like the Eastern world, such as Persia and beyond. And again, I just want to mention though that Roman encounters with Germanic, Celtic, and Slavic peoples was a long one, and it was mainly peaceful, something not really talked about in the book. But over time, it would become, I mean, because of the frontier aspect of it and the push out and the using of some groups at the expense of the others, that there was a long process of Romanization of the periphery of the Roman Empire, these barbarian lands. And at the same time, this was also going to influence Roman culture. That we will continue to talk about more of this as we go into the creation of modern Europe later on. But just keep these things in mind. On page 185, there's a discussion of the way in which that some German aristocrats developed a taste for the Roman way, and you also had at the same time Rome really taking invasions and repelling off barbarian hordes as they saw them coming in and wanting to plunder. And so this was kind of a mixed, complicated set of things in the duration of centuries of the empire. And again, I think as you just kind of look at this evolution that takes place, it makes what modern Europe becomes make way more sense. And it makes World War I and World War II especially make more sense in the fact that there was a lot of difficulties resolving what is Germany and France, and where did the frontiers start and end? What about German populations in Russia, or the German populations in Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia? What about Austria? Isn't that Germany? Is that Germans? Or and in fact, the Anglo-Saxon invasion of the British Isles, our language, the English language, is a Germanic tongue that has just evolved so extremely away from much of it, but then heavily influenced by Latin and French. We'll get to all of that a little bit later as well. So again, I'm just kind of trying to draw into this idea of the Roman legacy in Europe mixed with this encounter with these so-called Germanic groups, so-called barbarians. And that extends also to the Celts, the Gauls, the Celts as they're called, and Slavic peoples. Okay, I think I've said enough on that. I was accidentally pause again on my recording, so there might be a little bit of gap there in my lecture. Okay. Moving along from that, which we will return to and more. Then there was actually going further east in Africa. So as it mentioned, there was contact between diplomats of the Roman world and China. There was interest in silk and spices. But ultimately, there wasn't a strong formal contact made. And then you had more really encounters with Africa and Ethiopians. Now, as it's pointed out in, well, I'm going to go back here, in the textbook, that Africa was only considered a province of the of an area in North Africa today, and that the rest of Africa was not considered Africa. So I also want you to kind of think about the maps and the way that things are designated happened over a period of time. The idea of being African was thought of as different, and even Ethiopians is a Greek word meaning like burnt faces. But I had a professor in grad school who was a classicist, and he even debates the ways in which the original Greeks used the term Ethiopian. And so in this case, they're talking about more or less the area that is of the Sudan that the Romans are using. But these are terms, the Romans often use terms that were already mentioned by the Greeks, and then they kind of morph them in their own way. And so I think that that's important to see as well, that not only was the Roman Empire going to define Europe, but it also, in a certain extent, defined other peoples, such as Africans, in a way that by European colonialism will be very problematic or controversial, to say the least. Okay, so that's just something I wanted to mention there. And so you can see, just briefly, the Roman world had its connections to trade on the eastern part, but is not as critical to the other aspects of the Roman Empire. I'm just going to skip that for now. It's a little bit complicated. So let's just then switch gears and talk about some things we already kind of talked about, which is society and culture in imperial age, and the way that there were upper classes and lower classes, and how those upper classes obviously lived a very different life than the common people. I mean, just look at the average life expectancy. Men, 45. I mean, right now I'm 41, so that's it, man. I'm like one of the top old dudes in the empire. And women, 34. Why so young? Babies are giving birth to children. Most babies die, and most women are going to die in childbirth, are due to complications of childbirth. So talk about real tough times to live in. That's not the Rome that you often that we're celebrating in history or looking to in the movies and beyond. Is that brutal existence that the majority of humans in this time had to suffer through. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind as well. And then the issue of slavery, it's huge. And it's huge, and it's something that we have to always think about. I mean, here it talks about 35 to 40% of Italy's population slaves. Wow. What kind of society is it? You can talk about it. Is it a republic? Is it an imperial? Are the people free? We're getting close to 50% of the population having absolutely no rights at all. And you did have upward mobility. Some could become free, but we're talking about 5% of Rome's population. So this is very problematic. Now, here's what's interesting. For as bad as it was, slavery, some slaves lived quite well. And that's kind of one of the other odd things about this, where you had teachers, artisans, and other people that that had positions that we wouldn't associate with slavery, but they were in fact slaves. Now, as I mentioned to you earlier, that Southern intellectuals in the United States always pointed out that democracy and slavery went hand in hand from the beginning. And the idea of a democratic republic and slavery are historically brought together. I mean, what's interesting is Thomas Jefferson, I have in that book, which I've referred to before, Defending Slavery, Pro-Slavery Thought in the Old South by Paul Finkelman as the editor. Thomas Jefferson goes back and talks about some of the things that are in this book about Romans and slavery. And so he says in his notes on the state of Virginia, he says, "We know that among the Romans, about the Augustan age especially, the condition of their slaves was much more deplorable than that of the blacks on the continent of America." So Thomas Jefferson wants to make a case to say, and I just quoted him word for word, we know that slavery during this time was quite bad, worse, in fact, than what we do. And then he says, with the Romans, the regular method of taking the evidence of their slaves was under torture. That was mentioned in the book. Here it has been thought better never to resort to their evidence. Here punishment falls on the guilty only, and as precise proof is required against him as against a freeman. So then he's trying to say again, look how much better we do things in our slavery. And then he goes off to talk about how actually that many tutors and so forth were famous names were slaves. And he says, but they were of the race of whites. And then he refers to Homer, who speaks of slaves as whites, and he basically says that the unfortunate difference of color, and I'm quoting him now, and perhaps of faculty is a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people, referring to the blacks. Among the Romans, emancipation required but one effort. The slave, when made free, might mix without staining the blood of his master. But with us a second is necessary, unknown to history. When freed, he is to be removed beyond the reach of mixture. Extremely hypocritical, also considering that he had relations with one of his black female slaves. But again, I just kind of want to show you the way in which this Roman legacy of slavery was thought of even by our own founders, and how the difference that Thomas Jefferson saw was that, one, he tried to argue that it was more humane, but two, because blacks were not of the same color, they could never be integrated or really become free in a part of the society in the way that Roman slavery did. All right, I'll end that there.